stay at home.
Right there, right? Meeting library vendors, Elsevier for the food, as well as for some of the content that we're going to share today. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is ask folks to make sure that you've signed in at the back of the room. And there's also some information from Elsevier about publishing. You're free to take whatever you like at the back of the room as well before you leave. And I'd like to ask that we keep the Q&A probably toward the end, so that way it'll give us time to allow all the presenters to go through and have and present. So there are four presenters today, or four panelists. The first one is George Woodward. George is the executive publisher, Health and Medical Sciences at Elsevier. He works on a portfolio of journals in health and medical sciences. And before joining Elsevier, he worked as a managing editor for two immunology journals. And by the way, two more things. It's going to be taped, as well as Elsevier has asked to take some photo shots of the class from the rear. So if anyone has an objection to that, let me know.
Your hair looks good.
Bad hair day.
Yeah,
Have a bad hair day.
I'm not.
So anyway, he worked as a managing editor for two immunology journals. As part of his current job, he presents to early career researchers around the United States, providing an insider's perspective on the publishing process and how to get the most out of it. Dr. Clayson, who is seated in the middle to the right of George, values hands-on problem-based learning with students in the laboratory setting to guide them through anatomical dissections. Her research combines the disciplines of paleontology, comparative anatomy, and the development to formulate and test phylogenetic hypotheses of vertebrate interrelationships. She is particularly concerned with assessing the role that fossils play in the interpretation of modern biodiversity and phylogenetics, as well as the role that phenotypic variations play in the interpretation of vertebrate fossils and systematics. Dr. Clayson's studies include morphological changes across ontogeny and over deep time, which offer a way to investigate pattern and process in evolution and help to generate more comprehensive hypotheses about how form and function interact. She also makes extensive use of museum collections worldwide for specimens-based research. And out of order, but Dr. Catherine Gallucci is at my extreme right, and Dr. Gallucci has practiced geriatric medicine in Philadelphia since '92. She received a medical degree from West Virginia School of Osteopathic Medicine and completed rotating internship and family medicine residency in New Jersey. She completed a clinical fellowship in geriatrics at the University of Pennsylvania Center for the Study of Aging and a faculty development fellowship at Temple University School of Medicine. Prior to PCOM, she was a founding member of UMD&J Center for Aging. And last but not least, Dr. Brent Rollins. Is it Rollins or Rollins?
Rollins.
Okay, so that's...
Like Jimmy Rollins?
Okay.
Like local guy?
Mm-hmm. His teaching experience includes pharmacy management, research methods, pharmacy skills, and biostatistics. His research interests includes pharmaceutical marketing, direct-to-consumer advertising, consumer behavior, and community pharmacy practice. He is a journal referee for the Journal of the American Pharmacists Association and has presented and published on numerous subjects in pharmacy practice, including drug advertising, patient satisfaction, patient drug information, and pharmacy simulation software. So the panel should cover these four areas. Preparing your manuscript. The goal is to provide background information on academic publishing by outlining various important steps that, as an author, you need to follow in preparing your manuscript for a successful publication. Structuring an article. The aim is to provide advice about how to properly structure your article, from keywords and titles right through to the conclusion and references. All essential criteria will be covered. The third item is using scientific or medical language successfully. and including the correct tenses and grammar. And the fourth one is getting your paper noticed. There are currently more than 1 million scientific articles published every year. With that in mind, it's important for researchers to find an efficient and impactful way to make your research stand out from the crowd. And with that, I'd like to kick it over to George.
Thank you.
So we're gonna jump in on you. Is that the way this is gonna work, or?
If you do it nicely, please, yes.
Okay, fair enough.
So I'm going to lead us through the majority of the presentation today, but we have the benefit here of having three very experienced authors or reviewers who will be representing kind of the PCOM. Do you call yourselves PCOM, or is that, okay, good.
PCOM is
PCOM,
preferred.
do you prefer?
Yeah, it's not a .com after all.
Exactly. I come from a society where people would always pronounce it a certain way in the acronym, and it wasn't how we said it. So thank you. So from PCOM, we have three very distinguished and experienced authors and reviewers who will be able to kind of lend their insights as well, particularly for some of you who may not have some experience, you may not know some of the questions you want to ask yet. I think that'll be useful, and so I will be prompting them at periods throughout the presentation to weigh in. But when time comes for questions, please also know that they're available to answer questions based on their experience. So we're going to start with the big picture, which is the history of scholarly publications. Scholarly journals, as we know them, have been around for about 350 years. They started in 1665 with the Royal Society in London, publishing their philosophical transactions. And then for a couple of hundred years, really things don't change very much. You get used to receiving the journal once a month, once a quarter, once a year, delivered by mail to your mailbox, usually because you're a member of a society, a professional society, and that's one of your benefits of membership. Starting in the 1800s, we start to refine the modern idea of peer review, which is the idea that we can take a manuscript and have, before we publish it, have some selected experts take a look at it, provide feedback, help to refine it, and then publish the paper. And this is really how things go for quite some time. But all of a sudden, starting in 1989, as with so much of our society, things change pretty quickly. The fellow whose picture is shown there is Tim Berners-Lee, who led the World Wide Web project, which of course had huge ramifications for society as a whole, not just for scholarly publications. Then when Google comes along about 10 years later, all of a sudden, all the research that's out there becomes discoverable in a whole new way. You're not reliant on the print resources. You're not reliant on these huge manuals that they used to put together listing all the different journals that were available. You can search for things. And this is great because it's engaging researchers from parts of the world who maybe weren't able to be a part of the process before to the same degree. Now they can find that research. Now they can get to that research that much easier. But then we take it to the next step in just a couple of years later with the birth of the open access movement, which says it's great that people can find all this, but how about accessing it? If I've got a researcher who's based in sub-Saharan Africa, oh, please. I can. All right, I'm official. There we go. Okay. So then it says, okay, I've got a researcher in sub-Saharan Africa. They can get to the article. That's great, but most of the journals are based on the subscription model. Most of them rely on subscription funds in order to survive. And if I'm in a sub-Saharan African institution, I don't necessarily have those subscription funds available. So that's where open access comes in. It says, well, there's a lot of people out there who need the access. How can we help them to get it? And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. I'm going to highlight just a couple of the others up here. PubMed Central, which is an extension of PubMed, which of course was the National Institutes of Health saying, well, we sponsor a lot of research. There's a lot of medical research out there. How do we help people to find the most useful, the most relevant, and the most reliable medical research? And then with PubMed Central, they take that idea, merge it with open access, and they say, we fund an awful lot of research. We want the people who are part of the United States, the citizens of the United States whose taxes indirectly pay for all this, to be able to access all that research. And that's where PubMed Central comes in. And then kind of more recently, you'll notice these three logos down here for Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, because social media 5 years ago, if I gave one of these talks and I talked about social media, people would kind of laugh. What are you doing talking about that? That's how I share cat photos. That's not a part of a serious conversation. But currently, on social media combined, there's a mention of a scholarly publication once every 7 seconds, which, granted, in the world of social media, doesn't put it on par with certain celebrities or political topics, but it's still a hugely impressive amount of discussion taking place on those platforms. And then finally, just thinking about the ways that people are reading now compared to 1665. For so many years, the journal comes in a very similar shape and size. It's a rectangle. It's about this size. If you've got figures in them, they're probably about yay big, kind of hard to read, always in black and white. But now people are reading in a whole variety of different formats. They're reading computers, of course, but more and more on tablets, on phones. And as authors, that's something to consider, because we've discovered one of the things over the last few years is that it takes an awful lot of effort to click on something or to scroll down. And so really, in trying to get people to engage with your research, with your articles, it can help to be aware of that and how reader patterns are changing. What has remained the same are these top 4 right here, which have always been the role of scholarly publications going back to 1665. Registration, who submitted the scientific results first, that claim to primacy. Certification, performing peer review to ensure validity and integrity of the submissions. What separates this? I mean, and I think this is probably increasingly important, right, in today's world, because one of the areas I work in is nutrition, and I can tell you there's a ton of stuff out there about nutrition, and there's a ton of really questionable stuff out there about nutrition. Now, is peer review perfect? No, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Dissemination, providing a medium for discoveries and findings to be shared. Obviously, this one has changed the most. This is probably the one where people are really starting to dig in and think about what it means to be a publisher, what the value of a journal is. Preservation. We take for granted that somewhere in the world there is a copy of that 1665 journal that will be largely readable to the readers of today. You might have to use white gloves to handle it or something special like that. But if we think about the modern world, where there's many journals that exist only online, and if you're publishing your research, if you're publishing your articles only online, what does that mean 10 years from now, 15 years from now? And that's a part I think we increasingly overlook. Even people at Google have commented on that with pictures. You know, we can pull up photographs from 100 years ago with no problem, but the photographs from today largely exist digitally. How can we preserve that all the information from now remains accessible? And then the final component of the role of scholarly publications is to promote and facilitate the use of scholarly information. It's great that this is all out there, but if you can't find it, if you can't access it, if you can't use it, then it really is serving no purpose. How big is the world of scholarly communication? I pulled some numbers from our Scopus abstracting and indexing database, which doesn't cover the whole world. And it's worth noting that now. But it is a fairly comprehensive look at what we see in scholarly publication. Right now, they index almost 23,000 peer-reviewed journals, plus 322 trade journals. The world of conferences, we track 90,000 events every year, generating 7.3 million papers. There's over 34,000 scholarly publication books currently in print at any one time. And then that filters down to the world of patents. 27 million patents draw from the science and research that is reported in these journals. And it's growing. In just the past 20 years, we've seen this immense growth in the number of journals. Right now, we're at about 30,000 is the latest estimate I heard, somewhere in existence, which means that no matter how arcane your research, how focused your research, there's a home for it out there somewhere. But it also means that as a reader, as a researcher, there's an awful lot that you're having to sift through constantly. One of the disclaimers I'll always add before I go into these kinds of presentations is that scholarly publishing is not homogeneous. Needs and practices vary greatly, and so when we talk about what works in one field, it's not going to be the same necessarily as what you see in other fields. This may be something as simple as venues of publication. In much of science and medicine, journals continue to be a very important way for communicating recent results. Books tend to come along with a little bit more of a big picture, kind of step back and assess where things are. But in the worlds of, say, computer science, it's all about the abstracts that you present at meetings. It's all about a different output. In social sciences, journals have a certain value, but for them it's the long form, it's the monograph that tends to have more value. Levels of funding differ significantly. This can be very important because when you think about something like open access, in medical fields, it's one thing to be able to say, well, okay, instead of subscriptions, let's do an author pays model. We'll take money from our funding and divert it there. And then the social sciences researchers say, well, wait a second, you're talking about 90% of my funding if you talk about that. So it really changes the question. It changes the solution that works best. Demographics make a big difference. Some of our journals jumped online very quickly because their readers, where they're based, the settings they're in, and the demographics, the age ranges, the geographic locations, it made sense. I've worked with a few, particularly in the fields of allergy and dermatology for some reason, where those people, you're going to pry that print copy from their hands over their dead body. There's no way they're giving that up. Normal review and publication times differ, and this matters if you're thinking as an author about where you're submitting. You want to be aware of what's considered normal and when you kind of have to start getting worried. We'll talk about that. Types of review vary, and so do citation rates. But let's dive in at the beginning with how to get published and preparing your manuscript. The first question you want to ask when you've got your research completed is, what kind of article am I looking to write? And there's a few different flavors. These are the three most common ones. One is a full-length article. It's probably the one you're most familiar with. Substantial, complete, and comprehensive pieces of research. So you want to ask yourself, is my research sufficient for a full article? Do I really need those 7 to 10 pages in a particular journal or electronic pages in the journal online in order to get my message across? Or do I have something briefer, like a letter or short communication? Those are useful if you've got a pilot study, if you've got a case study, something that's briefer. Thinking about this up front can save a lot of anguish because one of the most common reasons for an article to be sent back initially is if someone says, you've really only got this one very finite piece of data and you're trying to stretch it into this long article. Or less commonly, you've got a lot of data that you're trying to cram into this brief report. It's time to maybe think about expanding it. So thinking about that up front can really save you a lot of time.
Can I jump in real
Yes,
quick?
please.
So, I don't know, is this mic on? If you need, yeah, okay. So for those of you who are doing a thesis project as well, I would say don't even wait until you're done with your research, but think in advance of the types of journals you might like to present your work in and how then you can sort of design the thesis, because you'll be writing a thesis monograph first, and you can tailor that so that it's very easy to then transition into a journal article, so you're not really duplicating too much effort.
That's a very good point. Thank you. And actually, that ties in nicely to the third article type, which is a review paper. And
Each chapter.
did you want to weigh in?
I was just, my dissertation, my major professor was tired of students doing their dissertation work and then it never being published. So he made us, or myself as well as a couple other classmates, we were made to write our dissertation in article form. And so I ended up with 3-4 different articles from my dissertation.
Sure.
Because of how he made us write it up.
Interesting. And that makes a lot of sense because that has historically been one of the struggles with dissertations. There's a lot of great research out there that just kind of gets lost. So then the final type really that you'll run into a lot is review papers. And these often you'll accidentally create while you're doing a lot of your background research. The important thing to remember here, though, is for many journals, review papers are by invitation only. And so we get a lot of papers that come in unsolicited. And maybe it's something that's particularly unique. Maybe it's something that grabs the editor's interest. But more often than not, this is an easy way for an editor to kind of turn something back to manage the volume that they're sending on to review. So if you do have a review paper and you're interested in submitting it somewhere, reach out first. Email that author, email that journal, or email that editor, email that journal, and say, hey, I've just written this up. I'd be wondering if you'd be interested in it. And often, again, if that topic's unique,
I mean, if it's the 6th review on this particular topic and one appeared in New England Journal of Medicine last month, chances are they're not going to be looking at it. But if it's something unique, something that hasn't been done before, then there's a good chance that you might at least get that second consideration. So what are the ramifications? You know, there's a variety. One thing that we do look at is citations, which tend to be the easiest metric to track and probably the one that has the most currency with promotion and tenure committees, hiring committees. And so it's worth talking about here. I should note review papers tend to peak more slowly, but they tend to have on average about 30% more citations than an original research. When we look at journals in a moment, you'll notice that a lot of leading journals tend to be reviews journals just because they have that citation benefit. Short communications, those pilot studies, they peak earlier and they peak lower. But that doesn't mean they don't serve a purpose, right? One of the goals here is that you're setting the stage for future research, for follow-up research. Or maybe it's just a piece of information that didn't pan out the way you want it to, but it needs to be captured somewhere. I'm going to highlight here this blue bar over on the left-hand side. When we talk about the impact factor, that's the impact factor window, which is small. And I think that we sometimes lose that in the conversation. The impact factor is a very focused way of looking at things, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. So in terms of actually writing the article, much like most people don't actually read an article from start to finish, when you write an article, you don't want to write it from front to back. It all starts with the data. And that's why a lot of times you'll find the figures and tables are the first things to really take shape. You've got that data, you're trying to visualize it, and then you build onto it. You go with the easier things, the methods, results, discussion, which are easier just because they're relaying of information. They're conveying that information in written form. And then your conclusion, your introduction of the more narrative, the more creative aspects where you're adding that context. And then title and abstract, you probably don't want to even be thinking about until you're getting to the end. For a couple of different reasons. But that's how you really build an article for most cases in science and medicine. And you'll find that there's a very standard template that a lot of journals follow with the certain headings that you want to include. Yes?
One quick point on that. For faculty who use students and have students help them with research, the methods, results section, that's a great part for students to really, one, do, because it's pretty straightforward for the most part, and secondarily help them learn.
Yes.
So I think that's one thing that I specifically do. A lot of students do that part, at least initially. Obviously, we'll edit it away as we go forward, but at least initially it's great for them to get involved there.
And I feel like the methods section has been historically sort of downplayed a lot. When we were in the print world, editors had to worry a lot about page limits. And if you're trying to think about a way to easily shorten something, the method section is often one of the easiest to cut. And now we're kind of seeing some of the ramifications of that if you think about the reproducibility issues that are going on. And so you're seeing a lot of journals swinging back to actually asking for more detailed method sections. And so if you are able to be involved as a student or as a postdoc, I think that that's a very good opportunity to really stake your claim and to be involved in something that has a lot of importance. I'm going to highlight just a few of the pieces of the article. The first is your title, which, as I said, is probably one of the last things you'll write, but it's the first thing that people are going to read. There's a few general tips that we recommend. One is to try and use the fewest possible words. I've seen people try to fit their entire abstract into their title, and you get lost along the way. And again, thinking about how people are reading things, if your title's not fitting on a phone screen, then you're already losing people along the way, especially because a lot of those important words come at the end sometimes. And don't think you can just add a colon and then add a subtitle that's going to make it that much more improved. You want to make sure you're adequately describing the content without putting any kind of spin on it. What we see is that a lot of the clever titles, the puns and things like that, we all enjoy reading the titles, but we never actually click through on the article because we don't know what it's going to be about. We don't know what to expect. And with so much research out there, you really have to think carefully about what you're going to read. Don't use anything that's going to put people off easily, like an uncommon abbreviation. If someone from outside the field doesn't know what that is, they're not going to click on it just to find out what that abbreviation means. So again, just thinking about the title as a good introduction. When we send out papers for review, often it's the title, the abstract, and maybe the author list, just to be sure that there's no conflict of interest. So the title is the first thing for all of your readers. It's not just the readers after publication. It's the editors, the first thing they see. It's the reviewers, your potential reviewers, is the first thing they see. Which brings us to probably the most important part of your article, the abstract. I say most important because there's going to be a lot of people who never actually read your article, but talk about it as if they have. And that's because they read your abstract. And again, thinking about those reviewers at all stages, this is where a reviewer, who's a volunteer, remember, so they have to decide how they're apportioning their time. This is where they decide, is this worth my investment? Is this worth me spending several hours reading and providing good feedback on? And for that reason, you want to make sure it's interesting and understandable. A lot of reviewers will tell me if the abstract is riddled with typos or has kind of confusing English that I can't make my way through, I know that I'm just going to see more of that in the paper. And that's going to affect whether or not I want to invest my time in it. Making sure it's accurate and specific. There's this great study that I found in BMJ just a few years ago that looked at the frequency of positive words in abstracts, comparing the 1970s to today. And they found that between 1974 and 1980, about 2% of abstracts featured what would be considered positive language. It's up to just under 18% as of 2014. All of a sudden, a lot more research seems to be robust, novel, innovative, even unprecedented and groundbreaking. And that's great. I mean, it speaks nicely to science, but it does mean that we're sort of losing our sensitivity to those kinds of terms. So when I say the abstract is the advertisement, that comes with all the aspects of an advertisement, right? You need it to be accurate. You want to create interest, but you can't spin it. Yes?
So I edit for a journal as well, and I will say that I've sent it back before it's even gone out for review based on reading just the abstract and saying that you haven't given me any information yet, try again. Mm-hmm. And that's basically all I will tell them. And so I can't lead them too far into what exactly it is that I need from them, but usually they come back and it's much better. So
that's great. And I think that that's important is because you need to try and get the message across while at the same time recognizing that abstracts are by their nature brief. A lot of times you'll see journals cite a word limit that's somewhere around 250 words. That actually used to be the limit in PubMed. It would truncate after 250 words. And so that's when you get into the good stuff. That's when you get into the conclusion. And if you're cutting off at 250 words, all of a sudden you left out the important part at the end. That's no longer a requirement, a technical requirement, but a lot of journals have kept similar sort of limitations to try and encourage people to get their message across briefly. Yes?
The thing about that is, as a student, specifically a medical student who's going to be practicing in some way, shape, or form, whether it be DO, pharmacy, anything of that nature, that's a skill set. Mm-hmm. Because what do you do when you're on rounds? You have a patient case that is way thick, and attending physician says, "You case, 30 seconds, go." You have to take lots of information and turn it into something that is very brief, clear, and concise. Yeah. And that is exactly what the abstract is. So that's great for students to even take an article. All right, you create the abstract.
Yeah, it's a definite skill. There's no quip about a writer who said, "I've provided 10,000 words on this topic. I would have made it shorter, but I didn't have enough time." References is something else I'll highlight here because, again, something you often tack on without thinking about. You just kind of automatically cite these things, which is fantastic and should be done because we'll get into plagiarism in just a second. But at the same time, there are some caveats. One is to always ensure you've actually read and absorbed the material you're referencing, not the abstract, the whole article. One of those Murphy's Law situations, often if you're misrepresenting an article, the author of that article will be one of your reviewers, and they'll be quick to call you out on it. You want to avoid excessive self-citations, And some editors will look more carefully than others at reference lists, and particularly if it's an area they're not familiar with. One of the things that they'll look at for potential reviewers, et cetera, is to go to the reference list. And if 9 out of 10 references are all you or your direct colleagues, maybe that says something either about your preparation or about the size of the field and the interest in the field. So being able to really ensure that you're demonstrating that this field goes beyond you, that this area of interest goes beyond you. For that reason, you want to avoid excessive citations of publications just from your direct colleagues as well. Reference formatting has long been a nuisance for so many authors. There was one study a couple of years ago that found that people were spending hours of their lives on reformatting references. Thanks to modern software, this has been cut down dramatically. But even so, you'll find that a lot of journals are starting to move away from really being too strict about this and correctly saying this is something a copy editor can deal with later in the process. This is something you can be, maybe, you know, you want to make sure all the information is there because the formatting can only be so effective if the information is missing. But at the same time, I think you'll find that's changing. I'm going to highlight publication ethics a little bit, which is never anyone's favorite topic to talk about. Again, working in nutrition journals, my analogy here is always that this is kind of like fiber. You don't really want to think about it or talk about it. It's not that exciting, but it's really good, and it helps things, helps keep things moving. Exactly. So my disclaimer up front is that things do vary. I'll provide some general guidance here, but you'll know what's right for your field. You'll know what your journals are particularly caring about, but these are some general pieces of advice. When you're submitting to a journal, you're usually asked to confirm a variety of these things. Originality of submitted work, that the data are real and not fabricated, should be obvious, you'd be surprised. Obtaining of necessary permissions. So if you're taking material that's been published somewhere else, making sure that you actually have permission to publish it again. Obtaining of any necessary privacy waivers, and particularly in medicine, this is important. If you've got an identifiable picture of a patient, making sure that you've obtained that paperwork up front. You're not necessarily going to be asked to provide it to the journal, but they need to know that you have it if someone comes back with a complaint. That you've complied with the necessary research standards, that your IRB is on board, things like that. That you've complied with ethics and conflict of interest policies. That you've only submitted to one journal at a time. Which is, again, is something that tends to surprise at least one person in every audience I'm at. I usually see someone jotting it down and then asking me about it later. But this is an important rule here because it helps to, A, make sure that we're not wasting anyone's time. If you've got one paper and you're sending it out, 3 different journals are sending out to reviewers at the same time, it really creates a lot of redundant work there, and there's enough of that here. But it also ensures that you don't run into situations where 2 journals accept it and then go to publish it, and all of a sudden you run into the plagiarism issue we'll get to. Agreement of all co-authors. I had this nasty case just about a month ago where a senior author wrote to me and she said, this paper's listed in my name. I've never seen it before. I would like it taken down. And it turned out that what had happened was the lead author had worked in this person's lab, moved on, wanted to acknowledge that this person had had such a profound effect on her career, so she added her as a co-author, but never actually told her about it. The article got retracted. Feelings were hurt on all sides. Careers were impacted. It was not a good situation. Which brings us to authorship. Authorship policies do vary across disciplines, cultures, and journals. In medicine, many journals follow the ICMJE, or International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, recommendations that you have to meet all 4 of these criteria in order to be listed. You have to make substantial contributions to conception or design of work, or the acquisition, analysis, and interpretation of data. You have to have drafted it or revised it critically. You have to have given final approval of the published version. And that you agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work, and ensuring questions related to accuracy or integrity are investigated and resolved. That's the newest one. It was just added a couple of years ago because there was kind of a significant number of people who were saying, oh, I know that article's been accused of plagiarism or data manipulation, but I didn't work on that part of it. I worked on this part, so it has nothing to do with me. And this is saying, no, if you're listed as an author on this paper, you all are accountable for trying to figure out what happened, what went wrong, and getting that resolved.
Is that an Elsevier policy?
No, this is ICMG specific.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay.
Yep. So again, it varies, but most journals in medicine will follow some version of this. So you'll get used to seeing these. You'll note that there's certain types of authors who are excluded here. Medical company financed ghostwriters, for instance, who may have written the article but had nothing to do with the actual article itself. They are going to be more appropriately acknowledged in the acknowledgments because you do need to make sure you're disclosing anyone who's involved. But this is an opportunity, again, if you think about the mentor situation, appropriate to disclose in the acknowledgments, not meeting the criteria for author. A lot of lab assistants will do this. And this is where, particularly for the younger members of the crowd, the students who maybe worked on part of the article, this is where you may be surprised sometimes to not get an authorship credit, to just be listed in the acknowledgments, and this is usually why they're doing it that way. Yes?
I'm going to jump in right here. It is important to communicate with your thesis advisor and committee about this up front. So when you are drafting your portion of a thesis, that is part of your conversation, and I think it is your responsibility to do. So make sure that you are not going to be caught with any surprises when it comes to publication, and just be aware that something like this could happen.
With every aspect of publication ethics, the earlier in the process it gets identified and resolved, the better. Some journals are going a little bit more detailed. They're adding contributor statements where you can actually spell out exactly what people were involved in. And this is an alternative, sometimes a supplement to those initial policies. So-and-so was involved in study design and inception. These ones were involved in subject recruitment. This is nice because it's providing appropriate credit to people, but it's not yet a standard in a lot of journals. I think we'll see more and more moving this way. So some general principles. The order of the authors, depending on your field, can matter a lot. And we get a surprising number of quibbles over who's listed as a first author and whether you can have 5 people listed as a first author. So just thinking, again, these are the kinds of issues that you resolve earlier with your advisor, with your PI, getting that all sorted. In general, first author is the person who conducted or supervised the data collection, analysis, presentation, and interpretation, and put together the paper for submission. The corresponding author, this is where there's some differences. Often it's going to be your senior author, and this isn't necessarily a reflection that they're the ones who led the paper through or did all the work up front. Really, sometimes this is about practicality. If the purpose of a corresponding author on a published article is that someone can go to that person and ask a question or request additional information, putting a student or a postdoc or someone who may not be at that same contact information in a year or two really can hinder that. And so that's where often we'll see the corresponding author be the senior author who maybe has a little bit more chance of sticking in the same place. Word about conflicts of interest. These can affect authors, they can affect reviewers, and they can affect editors. All 3 are expected to disclose at some point. There are some pretty obvious ones, like a direct financial one. If you're an employee of a company that makes a certain product, you own stock, you have received grants or patents from or related to your work with a particular product, those things get declared. Then you start to get into some grayer areas. Indirect financial. I've had people say, well, yeah, this company provided $500 for me to go to a meeting 2 years ago. Is that going to affect the way I review a paper that has to do with one of their products? The question here isn't whether it is affecting you. The question is, could this realistically be perceived as having some sort of influence on you? When in doubt, disclose. Then you get into some of the even grayer areas, right? Especially with reviews, we see this as we move into some of the more open review ideas. There's career and intellectual oppositions. If you're reviewing a paper written by someone who is up for a position that you're up for as well, does that change how you're reviewing that paper? If you're reviewing a paper for someone who is going to be hopefully hiring you, does that change how you are reviewing? So all these different just awarenesses of the different biases that are out there. Again, doesn't mean it is affecting you, just making sure that you're aware of it, you're disclosing where appropriate. Yes?
And on that note, it is useful, I think, to sometimes, if you're going to list potential reviewers, people who maybe potentially could be a conflict that you would not want to review. And so you can be very polite, professional conflict of interest for something along those lines as well. As an FYI, sometimes it's a good idea.
That's a very good idea. It's not guaranteed that they're not going to be invited.
Exactly. But I think it discloses something.
Just disclosing it. Always make sure you provide a reason. Yeah. I think that's very important. My favorite one yet is I had a reviewer, or an author rather, who asked the particular reviewer be not considered for review because they had had a physical altercation the week before. I was so intrigued but could not investigate. But the person was not invited. So when most people think about about research ethics and publication ethics, they think plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? According to the Federal Office of Science and Technology Policy, it's the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And that's the key part, really, is without giving appropriate credit. I've found that so many plagiarism issues would have been resolved with simple quotation marks. How do we detect it? For most publishers, they're using a system called Crosscheck, which is a huge database. There are about 30 million articles as of the last count from 50,000 journals, many of which are no longer even in existence, 400 different publishers. And what it does is it takes your text and it compares it to all the text from all these different articles. And it flags if there's areas of overlap. Now, like with any good algorithm, that can create a lot of false positives. And that's where the human intervention comes in. That's where the editor discretion comes in. There's no hard and fast rule here saying plagiarism is this many words taken from this source, send it back immediately. So that's where the editor discretion really is important, and they'll still look it over and they'll think, well, okay, it's the methods section. There's only so many ways you can describe a certain method. Maybe I'll be a little bit more lenient there. And that's where a lot of journals, again, in the name of saving space, they'd sometimes just cite the methods that have been previously published. Good to a point, but if you're a reader and you're trying to reproduce how something happened, to have to chase down the methods from one article to the next article to the next article, next article can lead you down, well, a rabbit hole. It can be awfully hard. And so you do want to try and include as much as possible, recognizing that that can sometimes run you into problems. Correct citation really is key. And again, just acknowledging it. Did you have a comment on?
No, I think we live in a cut and paste world, even in electronic health records now. I shouldn't say this, but we know clinicians who will cut out of a physical exam note and paste it into their note, and that's not acceptable. That is plagiarism. And I think it's really important. The thing that helped me the most was when somebody said to me, the best thing to do is to read all your material in advance, get your ideas and everything in order, and then go away from it so that you're not actually looking at something while you're writing. Because if you're looking at something while you're writing, it's very easy to lift ideas or concepts, and you really want to be doing it yourself.
That's a very good point. Very true. So can you plagiarize your own work?
Yes.
This is, see, I like that. It's short and simple.
You can.
You can, if it's done right. You know, you need to acknowledge if it's something that you've said in exactly the same way somewhere else, you need to be clear about that. You need to be making every effort you can to phrase it in a way that's appropriate. But at the same time, there are acknowledgments. And again, the method section is a great example here. How many times are you going to really describe that? Where you start to really get an editor's attention is if your entire method section is reproduced. Then all of a sudden they start thinking, well, wait a second, does that mean this article has been published somewhere else? Are you just trying to get more than one study out of the same exact piece of work, or more than one article out? So be mindful of that. You know, introductions are another area where you tend to get into that copy and paste mentality and just pull it on over. And maybe there are times where it's appropriate to reuse some certain language. Again, as long as you're acknowledging it appropriately, that it's clear to everyone, because these are the kinds of problems where, as mentioned earlier, the earlier in the process it's disclosed and discovered, the easier it is. If you've got an article that you submit and you say, okay, this is previously appeared here in this format, that's one thing. If it gets published and a reader comes and says, well, wait a second, this is duplicated, all of a sudden it becomes a whole big issue. Editors may conclude that you're intentionally exaggerating your output, and it can really lead to some serious consequences. The big new one, besides authorship issues, which tend to be growing far more than plagiarism, is image manipulation. And it's not necessarily malicious in any way. Sometimes people are thinking, well, I have all this great technology, and that picture is kind of fuzzy. I'm just going to make it look clearer so that I'm conveying my message a little bit more easily to my readers. However, there's a definite difference between manipulation for clarity versus manipulation for deception or fraud. And again, one of those things you disclose up front, you make sure it's clear. Anything you've done is disclosed in the figure legend, because you don't want someone discovering that. Some general policies that we've put together based on, again, different fields. No specific feature within an image may be enhanced, obscured, moved, removed, or introduced. So if you're changing something for clarity, you can't just change one part of it. You can't just highlight that and make it look different, because you're affecting the way it sits in context of the picture. Adjustments of brightness, contrast, or color balance are generally acceptable if they don't obscure or eliminate any information. So you're not turning up the brightness on something just to eliminate this one particular area that you don't want people to see. Nonlinear adjustments must be disclosed, again, in the figure legend. And this is probably the most common one that people encounter. Figures or parts of figures should not be duplicated or spliced together from figures published elsewhere. And we see this a lot with different lanes, and people say, well, that came out so much more clearly when I ran it over here, so I'm just going to copy this and insert it here. That's the kind of manipulation where people really start to take attention. And that's because a lot of people who are doing that are doing it for deception or fraud purposes. They're doing it to misrepresent their data. So if you have, and increasingly there's software that can be used to detect this. What we've historically done is relied on readers, often reviewers, who will say, well, wait a second, I've seen that somewhere before. And it's always amazed me that certain researchers have such a mind and an eye and a memory for these kinds of things that they'll actually be able to remember that this figure really looks similar to one they read 2 weeks ago. But there are these people out there. There we go.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were identifying.
Oh, no. I have noticed things along those lines, but I just wanted to mention for your thesis, for those of you writing one, you will need to get express written permission to duplicate any image that you're going to put into your thesis. And so keep that in mind in advance. You can't just paste somebody else's figure and use that in your own thesis. You need written permission to turn in with your thesis. Otherwise, you will not get your degree.
Which is a lot easier to do now in the era of email. Frequently it just involves emailing the author and getting, that basically, quote, on paper. It's not really on paper, is it?
You have a question? In the thesis, yeah, you should. You'd write modified from, with permission from, yeah.
Right.
So again, when in doubt, disclose and cite. Why? There are consequences, and they can vary according to the severity of the misconduct, standards set by editors, institutions, funding bodies, and again, when it's discovered. Early in the process, you might get a letter of reprimand or concern from the editor saying, well, this was flagged by one of our reviewers, or I noticed this, you need to get this sorted out. Once an article has been published, we're talking about either corrections or, if it's significant enough, a retraction of an article. Now, there's lots of good reasons why an article might be retracted, lots of honest reasons why it might be retracted, but there's still a stigma. It's changing, it's evolving, and that's a good thing, but there is still a little bit of a stigma to having an article retracted. So you want to try and avoid that whenever possible. Some form of disciplinary action might be taken. According to the COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics workflows that most journals publish, there's an escalation here. You ask the author to clarify. If you're not happy with the author's explanation, then you escalate it. You maybe take steps to initiate some sort of retraction, but usually what that means is you pass it on to someone who's better capable of evaluating the research to to be sure that the research is up to snuff, that the research was done appropriately, and often that means someone at the institution. And this is not something that you want to go visit the dean about, but those are people where this often falls on their desks. There are often departments within who their job is to look into this. And again, that's something that can have huge ramifications for careers, and in a lot of cases could have been dealt with a lot earlier, a lot less issue. But let's move on to happier things. You've written an article. It is ethically compliant and unimpeachable. So of those 30,000 active journals out there, how do you choose the one that is right for you? There's a few questions you can ask up front. First, how do I reach the right audience for my paper most effectively? 2, how long should I expect to wait for a decision? Some authors find themselves under a little bit of a time crunch. Maybe you're graduating, you want to get this done in time. Maybe you've got a grant deadline and you really want to be able to disclose this. What's the reputation of the journal? The NIH just published some interesting guidance trying to take aim at what they consider predatory publishers. We'll get into those in a second, but basically saying that if this is NIH-funded research, we expect you to be publishing in a credible journal. So knowing what the reputation is of that journal. There's a few ways you can identify some possibilities. Checking your manuscript's reference is a good way to start. If they're publishing articles that are relevant enough that you're citing them, they might be interested in the research you're writing. Doing a search in PubMed, Google Scholar, Scopus using relevant keywords. I always recommend asking a supervisor or colleague for recommendations, because this is where you'll get the stuff that might not be publicly discoverable, kind of inside dirt or gossip. The new editor of this journal really isn't as interested in this topic as his predecessor was, so I think that we might have a harder time. Or this one's great, but they're a little bit slow. This one's reputation is declining, things like that. Librarians have tons of resources that can help you identify possibilities. So if you don't know your librarian, get to know them. Wonderful. In addition to the actual journals themselves, there are a number of databases and a number of other different resources that they'll have access to help you. There's a variety of different services now that allow you to take your abstract and paste it in, and it'll do a semantic match to identify journals that may be right for you. Some are publisher specific, some are publisher agnostic. The thing I'll note here is it's a matchmaking service essentially. And like with any matchmaking service, you're going to get some really obvious answers. You're going to get some that maybe you hadn't thought of, but you're right, that's a good idea. And then you're going to have some that really question what it says about you as a person, that anyone thought this was a good idea. So go in with a sense of humor, and usually try more than one of these to see which results make sense for you. Once you think you've got the right one, check out the aims and scope of the journal. That's where you'll get some of the nuances. Maybe it sounded great by title, but once you actually look at what they say they're about, it doesn't make sense. And flip through a couple of recent issues, or scroll through a couple of recent issues to see the kinds of articles they're publishing. Just make sure that there is actually some sort of appropriate relationship there. The most important thing is to be realistic about your paper. Chances are that the first journal you submit to is not going to be the one that ends up publishing your paper in a lot of cases. And so think about, how do I minimize that heartache, that process? So every paper is not going to end up in New England Journal of Medicine. And it's not going to end up in Nature or Science, and that's okay. They have certain things that they're looking for. They have certain criteria they're looking for. And if you have that kind of research, great, go for it. But in most cases, think about, okay, this is going to be the best home. And it's like applying to college. You kind of got your stretch school. You've got the one you're feeling pretty good about, and then maybe you have your safety school picked out at the bottom that you can go back on, but that will still be reputable for your research. So it'll still be a good home for your research. Yes?
The point on that is, especially if time is not, this is faculty, student, anything, if time is not a variable of consideration, and it's something where you think, all right, the top journal in my field, in my world, Journal of Advertising, Journal of Marketing, those sorts of things, or JAM in New England, all that, if they would actually review it, send it there. Because guess what? Rejection from them is a good thing. Because you learn. I mean, that's you learn. All right, I worded this word badly. And that to me is because you want the best result in the end. And if the best result in the end is learning from these great reviewers that review for these top journals, then so be it. Plus, just learn to deal with rejection.
Don't take
always a good
rejection as an
It's going to
insult.
happen. It's going to happen.
Yes.
Audience question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure.
And George, before you answer that, could you just paraphrase the question so that Georgia people can hear
Yep.
it clearly?
So the question was, if paraphrasing wildly, I submitted my article. It's been gone for an awful long time. How long do I have to wait before I actually move on, before I go on to a different journal? And the answer is always going to be very satisfactory. It depends. Because it does vary significantly from journal to journal, from field to field. A lot of journals are sharing kind of average numbers now about how long you can expect. So look at that. And then if it says, we usually get a decision on your paper within 28 days, maybe give them a little grace period on the side of that. We'll talk about peer review in just a second and why these delays occur. Give them a little bit of grace period. Always right to check in. Most of the journals have some sort of editorial office where there's friendly managing editors like I used to be, just waiting around to answer these kinds of questions. It can help sometimes to make sure that the paper is on someone's radar. I'm not saying the paper slipped through the cracks or things like that, but it doesn't hurt to give a little bit of a nudge sometimes. But you know, in general, if you are thinking about something like withdrawing your paper to move on because you're not happy with how long it's been taken, make sure you let an editor know that this is something you're seriously considering. Don't make it a threat. You know, just a very logical explanation about why you think it would be appropriate to move on. Because delays do occur in the review process. And chances are you want to be going back to this journal at some point, so you don't want to be that author who's always threatening them. Yes?
I know you're going to get to peer review
Yep.
and all, but sometimes it does take a little while to find a reviewer.
Right.
And that same article is going to have the same trouble finding a reviewer.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
I don't know if rules of thumb are useful or not, but for me, I would say at least a couple of months. Because just even to get the reviewers lined up usually takes 2 or 3 weeks.
And then their deadline is.
And then they have a
Usually
deadline beyond
2 to 4
that.
weeks sometimes.
So, you know, you really shouldn't expect to hear anything probably for 6 weeks, maybe 8. And then at 8, I think a nudge would be a good idea.
Because the ideal situation, right, is the paper comes in, the reviewer looks, or the editor looks at it that day, says, "Oh, this is perfect, and I know exactly who it's right for." They send it out to 2 to 3 reviewers who agree instantly, recognize the brilliance here, and submit their reviews. Fantastic. You've got a decision back within 2 weeks, maybe, at the most. But what more realistically happens is the editor comes up with a list. They'll send it out to those, say, 3 people initially. Half of those people aren't going to even respond.
Right.
Because we all know how much email people are getting. We all know how easy it is to just kind of pass things over. Maybe, I've got other things to prioritize. You don't get back. An editor's not going to uninvite someone. They're not going to retract that invitation right away. They're going to give them a reasonable chance to
Like
respond.
5 to 7 days later, they send you another mailing saying, we asked you 10 days ago to please review this article. Are you able to or not? Please respond. So, I mean, you know, like we said, I think it takes a couple weeks just to get the reviewers.
Yep. And you can see how that time can add up. But at the same time, reviewers are volunteers. You know, the editor's leverage here is that the reviewers are doing this out of the good of their hearts, and they are authors themselves often, so usually there's some sort of sympathy there. But we do a lot of surveys, and I'll tell you that every time a reviewer says, we don't have enough time to review, an author says, reviewers are taking too long to review. There's a tension there.
Well, and one last thing on that. Guess what? Waiting takes none of work. Doesn't take any work. It doesn't take any time. You just sit and wait. You go work on something else. Go publish the next thing. Write the next paper up.
Yes?
Actually, before you go off from here and finding the appropriate journal, having been a managing editor, how much of an annoyance is it for you in that position when somebody contacts you like description of the manuscript they're preparing, is this appropriate for your journal? Is that something that you did often in your job or were okay with doing?
I'm being very cognizant there's an editor right here as I answer this, but I will say that in my experience, usually that was welcomed because that's a quicker turnaround for everyone, it's quicker results, less investment of energy for everyone there.
And that's something you can do simultaneously. You can reach out to multiple places initially and say, oh, what do you think? And then have them ready to go if you do want to send it to the next one.
Because I find, and I don't know if this is true, but I've had this happen a few times in my career, where we painstakingly chose a journal, wrote the article that fit all of that was available to us, and then immediately receive a letter from the editor saying this is not the scope of our journal, even though it's exactly what the scope of their journal is. So I think on the editor's end, there must be certain types of topics that they're trying, or they know who their reviewers are, and things that we're not privy to. So that's why I asked that question. I never really thought about doing that until you started talking about it, which is sort of putting the feelers out before we even prep the manuscript and send it.
And we overlook that sometimes, that this is a human endeavor, that there are people on the other sides of all these email addresses on all the sides of the journals, and the personality and philosophy of an editor can have a lot of influence on what kinds of articles they're considering. Something may seem on paper a perfect fit, but if that editor doesn't want to prioritize that, isn't really interested right then, some of that is a timing issue. There is a subjectivity to any review. Yes?
I was going to say, I've actually had an entire manuscript of my own go through review, accept it, and then the editor was like, oh crap, it's 80 pages. We can't publish that. And so I had to cut 40 pages, put it into supplemental. And then, so it was cut in half, and the other half is available as supplemental data. So that's an extreme case for me.
But she's also had many articles accepted with no problems.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's pretty standard in anatomy.
Yeah.
Because of the way that we have to describe everything.
Sure.
Again and again.
So the final note that I'll make here is about publishing in a new journal. Because if you haven't already, you will soon be receiving all sorts of emails telling you about these fantastic new publication venues available. If you will impart a certain amount of money on them, they will do all these wonderful things. Now, yes,
I'm at the point where I see them and I go click.
Yep.
I really wish I could, block this caller on the email. I don't know how to do that.
You can.
I need to learn how to do that because they keep coming back.
Not covered in this course, but yes, it is an important line. And I want to stress, just because something's new doesn't make it bad, right? Every journal was new at some point. And we think about contributors such as PLOS, Public Library of Science, very young by journal standards. It's not 350 years old, has made a substantial impact on the publishing world. But even them, when they started out, they were struggling because they were proposing a whole new business model. They were going at things from a different direction, and they had to really get past a lot of people's skepticism and wariness. Now, if it's a new journal, you do need to be diligent. There's a few things you can do, and there's more available at thinkchecksubmit.org. So one is, ask yourself who's involved, and are they really? Because a lot of journals that are less scrupulous, that maybe have some ethical challenges, will make claims that someone's an editor when they're not really. So if you recognize anyone on that list, feel free to drop them a note and say, hey, I noticed you're on the editorial board of this. I'd love to hear more about that because I'm thinking about submitting there. Something like that. It's not always going to be a possibility. But taking a look at that list, I saw this fantastic example just a couple months ago where they had pictures of all their editorial boards, which was great, except even I recognized that one of them was Taylor Swift, and probably was not an editorial board member for this particular journal. It was great. And it was not, as far as I can tell, a joke, or it was just someone was harvesting images from the internet.
Maybe she's a good editor.
She's a
Maybe
writer.
she's just,
really
she
good
could be a
She writes her
fantastic
own
editor.
stuff.
You're right. You're right. I myself just last week was invited to be an editor for a nursing journal, which is completely outside of my scope in any way, and came a week after I'd been invited to be an engineering journal editor. So thank you. They recognize that. Somehow they recognize that. So ask yourself, what promises are made regarding peer review? Because this is often what separates a legitimate journal from what's called a predatory or scam journal, where they're just trying to separate you from your money. Are they making any promises? Are they saying, we will turn around your article in 24 hours? If so, probably not legitimate. Or they have discovered something that we really need to tap into. Has the journal published articles yet? A lot of new journals will never actually publish any articles. But one of the surest ways you can assess the quality of one is to take a look. There are advantages sometimes to being a first mover, but in cases like this, it doesn't hurt to be the second or third. What are their archiving policies? Again, something we often overlook. But if this new journal disappears tomorrow, what happens to your articles? Because they've already been published. Someone somewhere has a record that they've been published. You're not necessarily going to be able to turn around and submit them somewhere else. But if that journal is not discoverable, what does that mean? I highlight a couple of programs here called Clocks and Portico, which are publisher-institution alliances, which basically maintain dark archives. So if any of the participating journals go out of business, that ensures that the article will be still discoverable on some sort of authorized network. Remember that new journals, even if they are legitimate, they won't yet be indexed in Medline or PubMed or other services, and they won't have an impact factor. And this is just purely a product of the lag time and the approval processes for all of these. But if you submit to a new journal, particularly if you're one of those first few articles, and then you go look for it on PubMed, there's a good chance it won't be there, at least not right away. So I've mentioned the impact factor a couple of times. I'm just going to highlight it here because this is, a lot of people do weigh it into decisions about where to publish because they know that their promotion and tenure committees, their funding bodies may be interested. It was originally developed as a tool for helping librarians discriminate between journals within a specific field, and obviously has taken on a whole life of its own since then. This is how it's calculated. For example, the current one, the 2016 impact factor, looks at 2016 cites to articles published in that journal in the 2 previous years, and then divides it by the number of articles published in those 2 previous years. So it's not an article level metric. Classic examples are Nature, New England Journal of Medicine tend to do well in these metrics. Are there articles that they publish that are poorly cited? Sure. That's just the law of these kinds of ratios or averages, right? There are huge variations from field to field and from type of journal to type of journal. I talked about the review advantage when it comes to citation, but just thinking about the different fields, I've highlighted here the top field in each of these different categories, ranging from medicine, general, and internal with New England Journal at the top at 72, to the top biomedical engineering journal, a review or annual review of biomedical engineering at 10.5. Does that mean that the articles published in annual review of biomedical engineering are less quality than New England Journal? Of course not. It's a field variation.
It's readership also.
It's readership, exactly. A lot of clinically focused journals, that's not going to be their currency. That's not going to be how you measure value, is the citation. Because if a practicing physician is making use of your article, it's a success. Are they then turning around and citing you? Probably not. So there's all sorts of fields, all sorts of considerations going here. Another one that I'd highlight is in pediatrics there with JAMA Pediatrics 10.2. A lot of pediatrics research, for obvious reasons, gets published outside of what we would consider a pediatrics journal. It's being published in ones that are focused more on certain disease states, ones that are focused more on certain specialties. So you've selected your journal. You're feeling pretty good about it. I do recommend people take a look at the instructions for authors. I will note, again, as we discussed, I'm a former managing editor. And the instructions for authors are my war and peace. I spent hours of my life crafting this beautiful tome, pages and pages of the most amazing writing you'll ever find that no one is ever going to read in its entirety. And I'm okay with that, and I think that is acknowledged. But it is worth noting that sometimes journals will have little idiosyncrasies that you can only find if you're flipping through your instructions for authors. And so what you need to learn as an author is to quickly distinguish and identify what's different about this journal. What's that section it's asking for that no one else has? Because ideally, when you're submitting to a new journal, you want to be thinking about their format to some degree. Some are more strict than others, but you want to at least make an indication that it's right for their journal. Kind of along the same lines, if you're submitting to a new journal, make sure you update your cover letter, because it's surprisingly frequent for someone to receive a cover letter that's addressed to the editor of another journal. And while I think all editors recognize that they are probably not the first destination for a lot of these articles, no one likes to be reminded of that. So now we're going to go briefly into the journal publishing cycle, or as I call it, where did my paper go? Will I ever see it again? We talked already briefly about the peer review process, but it's worth noting that we start with submission. And in most fields at this point, that involves an online system. And there's about 5 or 6 that really dominate most fields. And occasionally you'll find someone that allows you to email. They're in certain fields, but they're increasingly less common. But for most cases, you're looking at one of several different submission systems. And the advantage here, of course, is that once you've seen one system, you'll probably see it again. You'll get used to it. You'll get used to what's going to ask for. What's a good time to go get a cup of coffee, because it's going to take a while to kind of grind through this particular step.
Piece of dial-up and my figures being so big, it would take an entire day sometimes to upload.
Well, I'll take you further back. When I first started, you would receive the manuscript in triplicate in the mail.
Oh, I had to submit a few like that. Journal of Morphology before it did that. Yeah.
And it was, so you think about this, right? You get, in the office, you get all these packets every day in mail. It's very exciting. And then you have to invite the reviewers. And so you FedEx it out to them. FedEx copy of that manuscript along with an invitation to review. You hope they say yes. Because when they do, they're going to fax you a copy of that review. And if you don't know what a fax machine is, they're in a museum somewhere, I'm sure. But the faxed review would come in, and then you'd have to communicate to the author again by mail. So I promise you that as you are fighting with the submission system, as you are cursing the submission system out, just remember, it is actually an improvement over where things were just a few short years ago. And one of the other advantages that I think we downplay sometimes is the number of people from around the world who are suddenly able to be engaged in this process. Because when you've got authors who are able to just go online and submit a manuscript, you've got reviewers who it's just they're just an email away. It really does help diversify the process so much. Peer review I won't linger on because we already talked about. Just to say here that there's a few different variations, and it's good to know which one the journal you're submitting to uses. In medicine, most common is what's called blind or single blind, where the reviewer knows who you are because you're listed on the manuscript, but you don't know who the reviewer is. There's also double blind, where a journal will instruct you to, and this can be found in the instructions for authors, they'll instruct you to strip out all the information about you, anything that identifies you. So no cover page, making sure you're not in the header on the top of any document.
Not in the profile or the, was it, there's some sort of preferences section to your PDF, etc.
Yes.
Yeah, and reviewers too. Don't use your name when you're reviewing. I hate that much. I have to go and delete them all. Worse,
and in my experience, some of the journals will allow you to send comments directly to the author, and some of them will not. Some of them will only let you send comments to the editors, and some of them will allow you to do both, which is a really interesting thing as well.
I have to admit, I haven't run into that one yet. That is interesting.
Not JAMDA.
No, they don't. Now, double blind, of course, the benefit, the theoretical benefit here, right, is that you're getting reviewed without any sort of bias about what institution you're at, what stage you're at in your career, whether there's a conflict of interest with that particular researcher. So that's the theory, is that it kind of makes everything a little bit more democratic, a little bit more equitable. The caveats to it are always, depending on the size of the field, it's often easy to kind of figure out at least one of two places that it's coming from. And when in doubt, you look at the reference section and you say, oh, yep, I know who that is because they kept on citing themselves. Which brings us back to our earlier point. Open peer review goes the opposite direction. It says, well, why are we hiding peer review in this black box at all? Let's make it all open. Authors can know who reviewers are. Reviewers can know who authors are. Maybe we'll even go ahead and publish those reviews afterwards, and then readers will be able to see the full transparent process. You know, I've worked with a few journals that have done this, and there seems to be some sort of rule that if you offer a reviewer the option of being named, 45% will say OK. And I've talked to publishers who work at other journals that do this, and it tends to be a fairly common number for some reason. So I don't think we're quite there yet, but it is one that a lot more journals are experimenting with, and you'll probably see some changes there. And the second main point that I'll pull on here is pre versus post publication. With people saying, well, why do the reviews need to take place before publication? Why can't we put the article out there and then invite people to comment? That's what they do anyway, right? There's a lot of interesting experiments here. I always get wary about it from the medical perspective because I think there's enough misleading or questionable stuff out there. But it is something that a lot of journals are starting to move into in some format at least. When you get a decision on your initial submission, it's usually going to be one of 3 different flavors. It's possible you'll get accepted on the first submission. It's incredibly unlikely that you'll be accepted on the first submission. I read recently that the Watson Crick paper on DNA was accepted without even going out for peer review. The editor just wrote back and said, this is so self-evidently right, we're going to accept it. So if you receive a submission, or if you receive a decision saying, hey, this is accepted with no changes because it's brilliant, I want you to go back to the earlier slide I had about assessing a new journal and whether it's legitimate. And ask yourself, do I have a Watson and Crick paper, or maybe do I need to take a careful look here?
And is there a Rosalind Franklin?
There we go. Fair point, fair point.
Okay.
So, one of the 3 flavors you'll run into. Rejection, most common. Most journals reject somewhere around 70% of papers on first submission. Learn from feedback, improve the work for resubmission. Is it possible to contest? Yes, but what you want to do there, wait 24 hours. Let the sting subside. Don't write back in anger. Ask yourself, was this paper rejected for one of 2 reasons? A, substantial misunderstanding of my paper by one of the reviewers or the editor. I don't mean in 30 pages of comments there's one that's wrong. I mean they completely obviously have no idea what a T cell does, and their review was based on that. Therefore, this is a flawed review. 2, and this is the hardest one to prove, is there an obvious bias? I was never going to get through this review process because the reviewer is so biased against this school of research that they were never going to let me through. If one of those 2 is correct, you may consider writing a letter back to the editor outlining your concern and why you feel that you deserve a second look. Be mindful that the editor may share your response with the original reviewers, so do not question their intelligence. Do not say things about them that you wouldn't say to their faces. All of which I've seen done, and then the editor gleefully forwards it on, and remember that reviewer knows who you are, and it becomes just a whole mess. But there is always a pathway for, if you feel you've been done badly by the review process, to ask for second consideration. The next 2 most common types of decisions are all revision. And you might not necessarily see the difference between the 2 of them. One tends to be more minor, one major. If you get what looks like a minor revision, just a few comments, mainly stylistic, aesthetical, asking you to add a few things about the way that you're presenting the work, make them quickly and send it back in while enthusiasm is high. You don't want to let people sit around on your paper because maybe if you wait a couple months, things will have changed. New research will be available that will make yours seem less exciting. Maybe the editors will have cooled a little bit, the reviewers will have cooled. If it's major revision, remember that you don't have to make every change that an editor or reviewer asks for. If a reviewer says, this paper would be great if you only do these 3 additional experiments, it's only going to take about a year, and then the paper is going to be fantastic. Push back if you don't think that's appropriate. Say, you know, I just think this is outside the scope of the current paper. I get the point. That there's always the standby, thank you for your comment, which precedes pretty much every comment, but it's wrong. But you won't say it that way. But if you feel a remark is not justified or request is unreasonable, say so, but substantiate your response. And then submit a highlighted version, making it clear where the changes have been made for each point. Again, reviewers are busy people, editors are very busy people, and they are assessing your work. Anything you can do to curry good favor by making it as easy as possible for them is great. Acceptance is not guaranteed. Maybe your responses highlight a problem that wasn't visible before. Maybe your responses are inadequate in some way, and the editor doesn't think it's worth going back and forth over this more. So just be aware that you can still be rejected at that stage. You've been accepted. We're moving on. This is where it enters the production cycle. One of the things that technology has introduced is that we've gone from being able to offer pretty much the handwritten version that the author first constructed on papyrus or whatever it was on, and then the final published version, to now being able to offer all sorts of different stages in the article life, all possibly made publicly available. We don't have time to go into the subject of preprints today. It's a whole other issue. But a preprint is the version that you're going to be submitting to a journal. So it hasn't gone through peer review, although it's probably had feedback from at least people close to you. There's the accepted manuscript after it's gone through the journal's review process. It's ready to be accepted. The typesetters haven't gotten their hands on it yet. There's the document proof after it's been copy edited. Authors have a chance to review it. It's been prepared for publishing, laid out in the journal format. And then there's the final version with the journal branding, pagination, et cetera, on there. Now, why is this important? Because especially as journals try to react to authors' desires for more speed, what we're seeing is that more and more journals are making earlier and earlier versions of these articles available. And where this matters from a journal perspective, for instance, is the accepted manuscript. If they accepted that Word document, they're just going to take that and they're going to post it online, usually pretty quickly. And it's surprising to me just how many people find that this is the time when they discover they misspelled an author's name. They made some kind of silly, crucial mistake there, that, a typographical error that they don't want the whole world knowing that they made. I had one just last week, actually. An author misspelled her own name.
Oops.
And they didn't catch it, and it got accepted, and it got posted, and all the indexing services came in and started indexing it, and all of a sudden, she said, well, hold on, PubMed has this article up, but it's not under my name, and this is why. And that is surprisingly difficult to untangle sometimes. So where it matters to you as an author is making sure the version you submit at any stage, but especially for a revised manuscript, is as clean as you would want. Ask myself, would I want people reading this? Because if the journal is putting it out there, you're not going to have that opportunity to take a look. And yes, it will eventually be superseded by the document proof, by the published journal article. But for the metadata, that's often generated earlier in the process. And so that might stick with it a little bit longer than the actual text.
Can I just
Please.
Say one thing about that? You've got to read and reread and reread and reiterate, and you have to go through multiple iterations before you get it to where it's even readable, right? That's the way it works. The first time you write it, it's just going to be horrible. And you're going to cut out 50% of the words, and you're going to keep paring it down and iterating until you get what you want. The bottom line is you will be so intimately involved with what you've written that you will not see the errors. How is it possible that an editor didn't see that her own name was misspelled? It's because she lived with that so much, and she was so intimately involved with that document, that manuscript, that she couldn't see it anymore. Yeah. You really, really, really need somebody else to read it for you, someone that you trust, somebody who has an editor's eye.
Or just even your roommate.
Wife.
Just let them look at it real quick.
Yeah, at least one other. But I think somebody who's an editor.
Yeah. That would be ideal, obviously. Yeah.
It would be ideal, but you absolutely can't trust yourself.
And someone who's not directly involved with the research, they're going to not make those mental shortcuts.
Yes.
I've heard some people say that with the abstract, at least, they'll read it out loud. Because that way, also, you find out where you're stumbling. You find out what you're just naturally filling in when you're writing it.
Have somebody read it to you.
Yes.
It's even better.
There we go. Once your article is accepted, it's going to be distributed in any number of ways. And this is where, again, the technology aspect comes in. So your article that looks one way in print might look completely different once it's been translated into an HTML version, once it's been translated into an app. I already talked about archiving, but I'll highlight it again. And my conflict of interest disclosure here is that my mother-in-law is an archivist, and so I feel like I have to talk about archiving anytime I talk about these kinds of things. But in no way has created any sort of influence on the way I'm presenting this information. Author rights, it's a huge topic, probably one of the more misunderstood when it comes to publishing, because what I often find is a lot of people are more restrictive than they need to be, because they sign some sort of scary-looking paperwork and they just assume that this means that they have no rights anymore and the paper is no longer theirs. This is not true. We'll start with some copyright fundamentals. and I'm being cognizant here that there's at least a couple of people in the room I was talking to earlier who have a legal background and who will, I'm sure, send me nasty looks if I say anything incorrectly here. So, authors, and in some cases their employers, have a rights under national copyright laws and international treaties to control how the works are to be used and distributed to others. From the moment you write it, it's yours, unless your institution says it's theirs. Either way, it's yours or theirs, and no one can do anything with it until you or they say it's okay. The extent of copyright rights allows authors to permit copying, distribution, online access, translation, and creation of other derivative works of research. That means, as publishers, we can't publish it until someone says it's okay. Copyright protects the way that you express your thoughts and describe your research. It does not protect the underlying facts or ideas of your work. The copyright of the paper, based on your research, does not equal any kind of copyright about the research itself. Again, publishers can't publish an article unless they're granted the right to do so. This is usually done through some sort of paperwork, publishing agreement between the author and publisher. There's a couple of different versions. Most commonly in subscription journals, it's common to transfer copyright to the publisher, transfer copyright agreement. In open access, the movement has been more for the authors to retain the copyright, but grant publishers the license to publish their article. And usually there's other paperwork comes with that. We'll talk in just a second. I promise this won't be too long and excruciating a section. But it's hugely important. So authors retain copyright of your article under open access. Patent, trademark, and other intellectual property rights in the article are automatically retained. And the publisher would get the right to publish and distribute an article, exclusive or non-exclusively. And this is an important one, and why you'll often see some vagueness in the way language is expressed, the right to adapt the article for latest technology even after publication. So even thinking about the word publish, what that means, right? When we say you have the right to publish my article, in the old days it was simple. That meant you had the right to print it up and send it out.
It went into print.
Exactly. So easy. But now, when you say I have the right to publish the article, okay, in theory, online on my platforms, but can I then include it in the journal apps? Can I then take it and put it on other different platforms in certain formats? Is HTML covered? Is PDF covered? There's a whole number of different things. And of course, as we know by how quickly those technologies have evolved, who knows 5 to 10 years from now what's going to be there. And a publisher doesn't want to be in the position of having to go back every couple of years and say, hey, we've got this great new tool. Can we do this too? It logistically just would create all sorts of issues. Now, in open access, which again I'll talk about in just a moment more, but I'll note that you'll often be asked to sign what's called a user license. And what this does is it says, these are the things that anyone who comes upon my article is allowed to do without getting express permission. And the goal here is to minimize the hurdles, to minimize the paperwork that's involved, to minimize people having to come and say, I'd like to do this with the article, can I do this? Most common flavors break it down between what's allowed for non-commercial entities and what's allowed for commercial. So when you're selecting a license that you're okay with, if it's not defined by your funding body, because they often have preferences, think about what you're comfortable with. The counterexample that's often used for commercial versus non-commercial is if a publisher comes along and takes a bunch of articles that are published under the most liberal license, they can then turn around and sell that without saying anything to the authors. All they have to do is just acknowledge that the article was written by them and published somewhere else. But there's no other protection there. If you're comfortable with that, then that's great. If not, then think about what makes sense for you. Always know that under fair use of copyright, but also often under publishers' policies, you retain certain rights. This is an example. This is based on Elsevier's policies. If you have more curiosity, there's a publisher-agnostic site called howcanishareit.com, which will go into more detail. You can even enter in DOI for your article and find out what those journal-specific policies are. But this is just an example of what Elsevier's rights automatically are retained. You can make copies of it for use in teaching. Right? It's a scholarly use. It makes sense. This is the whole purpose of scholarly communication. You can share copies with research colleagues. You can expand it into, use it in a compilation, expand it to book form, or use it in your thesis or dissertation. I think this is one I get asked about the most is, hey, can I get permission to use my article in a thesis? you're usually pretty much, at least under Elsevier's policies, covered to do that automatically. You don't even have to ask. You do have to acknowledge that the article is published somewhere else than it published in this journal. That's just good practice anyway. You don't want that to be a surprise to anyone on your reviewing committee. Educational materials, using it in e-courses or company training, presenting it at meetings and giving copies to attendees there, and then for applications for patent or trademark rights. Now this is where, just make one point, this is where sometimes it gets a little confusing. We talked about the different versions of an article earlier. Sometimes your rights vary based on the version of an article. What you'll find is that the general rights policies tend to get more restrictive the further in the process you've gotten, because that's when the publishers put more and more and more work into it, so that the final published version is the version where you're going to be most restrictive. Because it is obviously not to anyone's advantage to have someone be able to basically recreate an entire journal somewhere else, right? Because in order for the journal to be sustainable, in order for it to survive, it has to be able to sell subscriptions, and who's going to subscribe to something that's completely available in mirror version over there? So that's where they tend to exert more restrictive rights policies. For the earlier versions, for your original manuscript, for your preprint, for your author-accepted version, that's where usually you'll have much more freedom. You'll be able to do more things. There may be something like an embargo where they ask that you wait a certain number of months after publication. But this is a policy that's been worked out for both individual authors and also for funding bodies. I want to give you a chance to comment here.
I had a question
Yeah.
related to platforms like ResearchGate, which
Yes.
I've started to use a whole lot more.
Mhm.
And I wondered if that sort of falls under the scholarly sharing section. I haven't posted all of my articles because I feel like some of them do have more
Yep.
restrictive dissemination
Yep.
requirements. But can you comment on that?
ResearchGate is a great example because what they were finding is that a lot of final published versions of articles were being posted on ResearchGate and made publicly available.
Yep.
And again, like I was saying, anytime you're getting closer to reproducing an entire journal, that's when people start to get worried. So for most non-open access journals, the final published version is no-go. That's especially for sharing it publicly. And ResearchGate does allow you to do some private.
Publicly, I guess, or
There's settings in ResearchGate, and anytime you're making it publicly available where anyone can download it, then yes. If you're sharing it in a public or private research group,
yeah. So
then
like
it's starting to
I've got it to now. A lot of them are uploaded, and then if somebody requests it personally, I can send it to that individual by itself for about I don't know, a good third of the articles or something like that. But yeah. So anyways, I figured
And
I'd
the
check.
other aspect of it too is that ResearchGate is a commercial entity.
Yeah.
They monetize, they make money off of all of this, and so the rights that are extended to, or the tolerance for the things that they do is different than, say, for like PubMed Central, which obviously, or your institutional repositories or institutional platforms, because the goal there is pure dissemination of knowledge. It's not to commoditize. It's not to make money off of it.
have.
Hello.
Yes, can I step in to say that PCOM's Digital Commons, we will put any of your articles up on the Digital Commons. We can find out what is able to be put up there, whether it's the final print or a earlier version like a preprint. And if you shoot me an email, we can basically answer any questions about, we can look up what is available, what is allowed to go up, and put that all up for you.
So would you say that a librarian is the perfect person to help you navigate the sometimes confusing world of author rights?
Yes, I will.
All right.
George,
Yes.
did you mention, isn't ResearchGate currently under some legal aspects? Could you speak to that if you're knowledgeable about that?
I can speak to some degree with conflict of interest disclosure over here that, yes, there is currently pending legal action between Elsevier and a number of other publishers, including the American Chemical Society, regarding ResearchGate and publishing of or posting of unauthorized versions.
Right, okay. Because it is up to the user at that point, and I don't think it's always 100% clear. So, meaning me, the user who sets up a profile necessarily, and so. Yeah.
And I think that that's the ideal, right? Is that the platforms and the publishers work together to try and
Flag it
make
or
it
something like that.
flag it,
right?
or even automate the process. Because with all these different versions, wouldn't it be much easier? And there's a program called Chorus that a number of publishers are participating in, that what it does is it basically works with different platforms and makes available to them the latest possible version that can be made freely available. So it's a way to hopefully automate it, because frankly, I think most of you have better things to be doing than trying to untangle all of this. But yeah, that's an evolving point. So I'm glad you brought up that. Other than that, I don't think I should probably comment too much. And wouldn't feel comfortable anyway. But yeah, there are some changes there that I would expect we'll be seeing. I'm going to talk briefly about open access. There are two main types of open access. They're discriminated by gold and green. Gold usually involves some sort of payment of a fee up front, or upon publication, not up front. If someone's asking for you up front, there's a problem. But payment upon acceptance of a manuscript. And what it does is it provides immediate open access, so free access with some sort of user license, to the final published version of your article. You're probably familiar with this. Again, I talked about PLOS earlier. That's their model. This is gold open access. Author pays, usually out of their funding body's grant support. Sometimes it comes from an institution. Occasionally it's out of a person's pocket, which always worries me. But that's how that article is made available. Some subscription journals, not wanting to deter authors who maybe are required by their funding bodies to publish open access, will offer open access options. This is called a hybrid journal. And so most of the subscription journals now will offer this. And what they then have to do is to make sure that they're not calculating open access articles into their subscription rates, because otherwise someone's paying twice. Bad thing all around. But it does mean that just because the journal's not entirely open access, you might still have options. And again, that's to try and make sure you're publishing in the journal that's right for you. Green open access doesn't involve any additional exchange of funds. The model here is, the best example is PubMed Central, which basically provides free public access to a version. It's not the final published version. PubMed Central just does your accepted version for subscription journals. And there's an embargo. So for PubMed Central, they allow up to 12 months. And so those are the trade-offs. In order to provide free access to a version of your article at no additional cost, you allow it to the accepted version and you allow it after an embargo. So that's kind of the compromise that's been worked out there. So those are the two main types. Always make sure that if your work is funded by a funding body, whether you're publishing out of a particular institution, that you know what the specific requirements are of both your funding body and your institution. Digital Commons was mentioned earlier. Make sure you know what your institutional repository requirements are for your institution. And librarians are a great resource for that information. Yes? Ah, terrific. Okay. Well, thank you. We talked about copyright. I'm not going to linger on that. Users' licenses. One thing I will note, though, in the example I gave earlier about why this whole open access idea was such a great idea in the first place, is to think about the researchers in parts of the world where maybe subscription fees are not feasible. I had someone I was talking to the other day that their monthly salary is $50, right? Does that mean that they don't want access to this article, that they don't need access to this article? Certainly not. It means that it's very hard for them to get access to that article. So that's why these programs, which are publishers in collaboration with the World Health Organization and a number of institutions called the Research for Life Collaboration, provide free or low-cost access to thousands of peer-reviewed journals in over 100 developing countries. And I mention this just because if you're worried that your research is not going to be made available to people who can't afford it, there are a number of options to make it available, even if your funding doesn't cover open access fees. Even if you're not funded in such a way, or you're worried about putting it out after this embargo of 12 months, there are still options for making it available. Patients have their own sort of programs that they can use for these sort of things. I think these are all important. Yes?
I want to just catapult from that for a second and go back to the step where you're doing the writing. If you cannot access something, it's no excuse for not trying to actually get it in a different method. So if at first you come across something on Google Scholar and you can't get a direct download, you need to try and go to the library and get that paper. It's no excuse to exclude data because you just can't get the paper quickly. I know it's a digital world and we're very impatient, but interlibrary loan is also a really, really great thing. And you've got the Easy Borrow as well. So just keep that in mind. If they can get it now in a country that has hardly any internet access, you should be able to get it for your own work.
Even
Oh, yeah.
You have to come into the library. Do it at desktop.
Yes.
And if all else fails, you know that corresponding author's information should be available in there. So if you're not able to access through Iliad, if you're not able to access through the different technological aspects, an email to the author might yield some results. If nothing else, authors usually like to hear that their work's being read or that someone's interested in it. And so I don't think I've ever run into anyone who says, oh, I hate those emails. I never respond to them. So my final section is going to be on getting your paper noticed, because it's worth noting the sheer volume of papers out there. Right now, as of 2013, so obviously things have changed, there are over 40 million articles available somewhere online. Unless you're extremely active or ethically questionable, you probably are representative for just a few of those. And so there's a good chance, a very real chance, that your research is going to slip through the cracks. According to one study published in Learned Publishing in 2012, 40% of researchers surveyed said they had not read the whole article for the last important article that they read. There's a time crunch. We don't have time to read all of the articles. So what can you do to try and get yours the attention it deserves? Spending time on your abstract, your conclusion, and your references. Most of your readers are not human. And I had someone ask me once if that meant dogs were reading their paper. No, it does not mean dogs are reading your paper. Mostly does not mean dogs are reading your paper. It means that most of your work is being read first by bots, by crawlers, search engines, by technology. And things that you can do to highlight your work to those machines, your new readers, are important. So putting the important terms in abstracts, which are going to be the most accessible and thus the most widely read, even by technology, part of your article, and in your title. We don't know much about Google's algorithms, but we know that it biases things that it thinks are important. And one of the things it thinks are important are titles, headings, and abstracts. Sharing your research data. This is an interesting one. One of the things we also know about Google's algorithms is it likes links to and from content. And so anything you can do to introduce a link in your paper taking you to the actual full data, then the data itself links back. This is great for the reproducibility issues. In medicine, there are some caveats, so I'm not going to get into data sharing too much here, but it's worth at least being aware of. Graphics, charts, illustrations. There's all sorts of research showing that on Twitter, for example, if you add a picture to it, it's that much more likely to be engaged with. And the same thing's true outside of the world of Twitter. So there's my images. Don't be afraid to talk about your own research. You don't want to be the person sitting in the corner who doesn't want to talk about anything other than themselves. But at the same time, you're the most familiar with it. If you've got a related contribution to make by talking about your article, don't be afraid to share it. One of the things that we've had a lot of good luck with is we've introduced a program where people can easily create slide presentations about their articles that then can be shared via social media, that can be shared on their own websites very easily. They sit alongside the article. And those are surprisingly popular. Those actually can help you to get the message out. If your article is sufficiently media-worthy, know about what resources you have within your institution, what resources PCOM has. Social media, again. According to a 2016 study, this is the important caveat here, 59% of shared URLs are never clicked on. So the tweet is the message. So really thinking carefully about those 280 now characters, and that makes it a little bit easier than when I gave this presentation a couple months ago. But thinking carefully about what the message of that is, because that's what people are going to take away. Forget reading the abstract. That's going to be what they get out of your paper. Social collaboration networks like ResearchGate, Mendeley, Conflict of Interest owned by Elsevier, academia.edu, there's a number of them out there. But the general tips, keep it short, Keep it accurate? Sure. And keep it relevant. Make it easy to find out more. When I was a new parent a number of years ago, I would read all sorts of parenting magazines, and they talk about this great, exciting new research on this topic, but they wouldn't tell me what journal it was published in. They wouldn't tell me what institution the research was coming from. I had to do the most incredibly obscure searches to try and find out what they were actually talking about. And then, of course, chances were that that one paragraph blurb didn't mesh with what I actually found. So make it easy to find out where to learn more. And understand that even if you're careful, your work may still be misrepresented. Many people will react even without reading the article. In my nutrition world, everyone's an expert. So when I get authors whose work is covered in the news, people are reacting to it without even reading the news article, let alone clicking through. And if you don't believe me, there's a link here to an article from NPR called "Why Doesn't America Read Anymore?" Published in 2014, it attracted all sorts of reaction online about how this was the decline of society, and this was everything that was wrong represented in one tweet. And if you look at the link carefully, you'll be able to see that it was published on April 1st, 2014, which is April Fool's Day. And if you click on it, it is literally a stub saying, "We've noticed people are reacting to our content, but they don't seem to be actually reading it. So we were just curious to see what was happening." And sure enough. And then the final point I'll leave with is, as authors, you own the research. You control that message from the beginning. There's a 2014 BMJ article that found 40% of the press releases they looked at included exaggerated advice, 33% exaggerated causal claims, and 36% exaggerated inference to humans from animal research. And when news articles were written based on these press releases, 58, 81, and 86% respectively. Somewhere around triple to quadruple the rates that they saw in news articles that were based on non-spun articles. Now, as the authors, you control the original messages like the game of telephone. You make it as accurate as you can. You can't control what's going to happen to it on the other side of the room, but you make it as accurate as you can. And I am coming close to the end of my time, so I think I will wrap there.
Well, I'd like to have maybe a few minutes for questions here. And I have the Georgia folks, I think, on screen now. Thank you, George.
Hi, Georgia.
Can y'all hear us down here?
Do you have any questions for the panelists?
I will actually say something about the actual writing process itself. It's frustrating. It can be tiring. It can be really boring. And it just can overall be somewhat difficult to do right. And so take advantage of sort of the writing style workshops that you'll see. I like to encourage my students after they've written even just the proposal to go over to that writing center and work through it. Read books on how to write. There's a good one called Style, Clarity, and Lessons in Clarity and Grace. And help with the overall process to have somebody review your writing as you're going along before it goes too far.
And the library also has
multiple authors working together on what basically assign different parts.
Well, I mean, if it's a study that's been done at the institution, it had to go through an IRB approval, which implies that there's a principal investigator and a co-investigator. If somebody's listed as the PI on the research proposal, that person is the lead author generally. And then you go from there based on the criteria that we saw, substantial contributions, et cetera. I've been involved in writing reviews of, like, for example, the new Pamoras that are available, not to get into too much detail, but we used a Delphi method to select a specific assessment tool, and there was a panel of us, of quote, experts who did that. And how did they determine who the first author was? The person whose last name started with A. Right, that's true.
Did Georgia hear that?
Georgia, did you hear that?
I did.
Can you reiterate it?
So the statement was basically, if you are a graduate student, you may not be the submitting PI on an IRB or an IACUC proposal. Your direct supervisor must do that, and so it can't be a one-to-one relationship if you're going to say that the PI on the project is the lead author. But you can make note of that and say it was approved by such IRB or IACUC under such and such lab in the acknowledgments or something like that. Yes.
And to think about your question logistically, who does the work? Just think back to when you were a student and you worked in groups. Guess what? There were probably 2 or 3 of the 5 that maybe not necessarily work as hard as others. So you probably have some bell cows in there that take the lion's share of the work, and probably a few that don't necessarily do so. But in the end, it's always about making the best product as possible and telling the right story. I think that's the biggest thing about even him as in his role is every single journal out there. I mean, to me, this is a game just as much as anything. Guess what? They need content. Like we have literature evaluation as a class, and looking at how, from a biostatistical perspective, all those things that go into analyzing and critiquing a paper. Well, typically that's done from a negative viewpoint. Well, guess what? Publishers and editors, they need content. I look at it from the positive. So if you tell the right story, that then they're going to want to publish your paper more so than they don't want to.
I think it can really mess with the flow. Oh yeah. Paraphrasing was it appropriate to distribute the work effort so one person does intro, one does methods, one does the results and discussion. In terms of just the writing style, maybe, but if you're all involved with the process of understanding that from the beginning, okay. I think the key is you need to be able to describe the entire thing yourself, ultimately, and with huge collaborative projects, that becomes a little bit difficult. You've got multiple experts on subsets within things, but I would say every person is then responsible to read the whole thing, because you can start to smooth out those differences as it goes along. So it could be appropriate to do that, and some people might be better at one of those sections than another person. So if one person was there to do all the experiments in the first place, yeah, they're probably the ones that should be writing the method section. If everybody is reading the results and analyzing those things together, then you guys can all contribute to that part together.
And in the end, who's driving the bus? Like that, you need to have one final person who is going to give that read through and say, all right, we sound a little bit different here than we do here. And you need that one sort of captain of the ship who is a one voice type person. You want to make sure it's in one voice.
It could be noted in editing too, and in review. I'll be like, this section is so much better than the rest of it. make it more like this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, we see this a lot when we're reviewing, and you know, and it's always concerning to me when the author, the original introduction and the statement of the problem and so forth is really difficult to read, and then when you get into the literature review, all of a sudden it reads beautifully. That's a big red flag. You know, then I know that that's been cut and pasted on a certain level. And to your point about stylistically and having a lot of different authors or a lot of different writers, you know, good scientific writing is good scientific writing. And I think everyone here is committed to that. And I think that if you have several writers, if they are committed to doing good scientific writing, there shouldn't be huge stylistic differences between the way the thing is stated. And if there are, those individuals maybe need a refresher in how to write in scientific parlance.
We have a lot of resources here at the school, right?
Yeah, we do. But I have to say this. You know, everybody always says to me, well, how did you become a writer? You know, I'm a doctor. How did I become a writer? And the answer is I read. Yeah. And that is the only answer about how to become a writer. No one can teach you to write. You need to read, and it will happen.
Well, thank you all panelists, the 4 panelists, for the good conversation. I hate to be a killjoy.
Oh.
Do you have any questions that you want to ask?
Thank you.
All right, so who in here are students? Like who? Like one? Just you?
There are a couple medical
Lone
students in
Rangers?